You said earlier that if GamerGate you feel never really reckoned with the fact that this came out of that Zoe Quinn, Grayson, Joanie drama
Right.
and the bad aspects of that drama. And what do you think GamerGate reckoning with that would be or look like?
Um, Part of it would probably have needed to involve dropping the sort of leaderless, anonymous online movement into sort of something a little more regimented and structured, like an advocacy group for certain positions. Like, gosh, it's a weird comparison to make like an ACLU or something like that. It would have been boring. It would have been a lot more of the like conference room Outlook meeting Xerox photocopy kind of a deal. It would not have been this wet and wild, loosey goosey, like exciting, like internet, like shitstorm. But it would have had legitimacy, and it would have sort of said like, okay, we're gonna like not engage in the same way as we did before. We're gonna move into something more legitimate. We're gonna have lawyers. We're gonna do this and that. We're gonna like have like all the like our shit straight and in order, and we're gonna like advocate for all these positions, and we're gonna like be advocates for positions. I don't know. I need to say the same thing over and over. I feel like that would have been sort of step one.
Do you think that an online movement, even if like some people in the leaderless movement do some bad stuff, that they should have to like dissolve the unofficial move, like the leaderless movement, dissolve that part of it and create like an LLC, that like a nonprofit group or whatever instead? Like, do you think they should have to do that? Just because like there was some bad stuff maybe at some point?
um, in general, I tend to avoid sort of making, or even really to the most part, pursuing like really general statements about things. Because I feel it's a little reductive to be like, okay, well, you think it should happen in this situation. Should it happen in all situations? Like, well, no, I think there's discretion on a per individual basis, and we like probably should judge each individual instance to some extent of like what should be done. So should it happen for everything like it? Well, it sort of depends what this sort of protest phenomena instance sort of is doing. Maybe it's warranted, maybe it isn't. I'm not really wanting to say it should happen all the time, but when it's warranted, it's warranted.
I guess you sort of saw where that might go. Because there's some other leaderless movements that have happened, and they've widely supported by the mainstream media, basically.
Um, Maybe. As I know, there's like the chronology stuff, but like, which ones do you want to, like, as an example, which ones
Well,
do you want to
Black
point to?
Lives Matter. I mean, obviously, like there's a lot of
Hmm.
people, most people involved. They were peaceful protesters. They used the hashtag on Twitter, whatever, right? They didn't
Yeah.
engage in violence. They didn't harass anybody. But like large numbers of people have also been killed by supporters of this movement, and in
I won't say.
riots, and people have lost their homes, their businesses. They've had their lives destroyed because of it. Like way worse than anything GamerGate did. But like we all look at that and be like, well, there was a lot of bad stuff, but like we think that there was a lot of good stuff too, and that most people probably who supported that weren't like bad actors. And we sort of like come to that conclusion. I think most people.
Like, it's also important to note that, well, first, like, yeah, there was some bad shit that happened. It was a minority of what happened. Almost everything that occurred globally was peaceful, and there were people at like all these protests or whatever that were sort of in charge. People, you have to get the permits. You have to sort of um,
I don't. I don't. I
what's that
mean,
word?
we were all
This is true.
around back then.
I
I'm not sure they got too many permits
I remember that.
to
No,
block
I
the
remember there was like
highways and
these.
burn down cities and hold peaceful protests. I don't think they
Yeah.
got a whole lot of permits.
Hmm.
This was like a
Well,
spontaneous thing.
there were things that did have permits. There were protests that had leaders. I
Oh,
remember
sure, there were like
there's
thousands of protests. Some of them are going to have
yeah,
permits, I'm sure.
like all over. Like most of it were. I think the one of the critical things to note is that like when it comes to the random acts of violence that did happen, because like there is stuff in the streets, and it is like to what extent can you ensure that something that big will be wholly unblemished by people taking it too far. I think that's a bit. It's not reasonable to expect that. Um, to what extent, though, is the violence intrinsic to the sort of doctrine behind the inception of the movement? Because Black Lives Matter is about like so much policing of black people does not seems to dehumanize black people, and we should like not. And so do you oppose that because like it gets a little wet and wild sometimes? Like it doesn't really make sense. But for something like Gamergate, it's like the initial thing that happened was we don't like this chick sleeping around to get good game coverage. And it's like, is that good? Like, well,
Well,
no.
I don't think that's like
So
that's not. I mean, there probably were
it,
some people who thought that, right? But like that's like not even entirely like GG thing. Like
yeah,
there's people who cared about ethics. And that's like most people. And there's people who the idea that like Zoe Quinn was some like super important part of the story, that that I don't think is the case for most people. And insofar as she is an important part of the story, it's because like she claimed that we harassed her, or because she went after Tim Saray, or because like people just don't like her. But like that's fine. You can like have a generalized dislike of another person, especially when like their actions are sometimes like not great.
it is the
Not
reason
regards to the not
everything.
in regards to her sleeping around, but like the other
Mm.
actions she did.
Yeah, I mean, she was not like the perfect victim. I suppose she was like fighting back, but generally speaking, like that is the reason everything started. Like there was the Zoe post, and then there was the burgers and fries and all the sort of sexist like response to that, which, and most notably, like here's the thing that I feel like really sort of hurts GamerGate's credibility in those early throws was that Zoe Quinn was like super harassed in terms of everything that happened. Um, but she was just the one sort of taking, quote unquote, allegedly taking advantage of the system, where like the journalists would be the one like offering all the coverage for sex or whatever. Like that's really the salacious like allegation. Um, Zoe Quinn was just allegedly the one taking advantage of it, but Nathan Grayson would have been the one perpetrating it. And yet at the time, Nathan Grayson faced no backlash. She faced no harassment. It was only Zoe Quinn in those early throws. All of the outrage was at her. Um, so that really sort of hurts the credibility of any sort of discussions trying to say that it wasn't about sort of sexist stuff. But I feel like the main point of the comparison between that and Black Lives Matter is that like all of the sort of harassment and outrage sort of naturally flows out from the initial thesis. It is a sort of logical conclusion of what happens when that is pursued. But when it comes to Black Lives Matter, it's not a logical conclusion that rioting ought occur because black people are not treated well.
Well,
Um,
I don't know if that's like. I mean, using that. Sorry, I'll let you finish your point. Sorry.
um, but yeah, I guess that's the criteria whether or not things wrap around back to does the violence like um, sort of should we consider that as being more important, or rather like does it negate the original concerns that and thought processes that sort of spawned the movement? I would say
Well,
in gaming it does, and Black Lives Matter does not.
just as that there's like these some people, and maybe not even GamerGate people, but people on the internet who are like hold more conservative views on sex and thought that this was wrong. That she had. Well, I mean, there's a fair aspect of it too, which like some people like don't like affairs. They think that cheating's bad. I mean, I think cheating's bad too, but like I don't think it's like a huge like society thing. I think that's like a personal failing more than anything else.
Mhm.
It's not really like the. It's not something that like society at large should like be like discussing on a
Right.
personal level, right? Like you can have like a generalized critique of like how prevalent affairs are in our society. I think that's perfectly
Yeah, that would
fine.
be.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, that
that's.
would be
But
of
it shouldn't be
interest.
about any like specific incident. I agree with that. But like there with the Black Lives Matter thing, you had some people in GamerGate or who were not even related to GamerGate, like just like some people who were GamerGate, and some people who were just like random people on the internet, who were like engaging in kind of slut shaming behavior or infidelity shaming behavior. And then you also had like you can say that like, oh, that's like these people who had this bad view that was at the core. I don't think it's at the core of GamerGate at all, but like some you could say that and you could express that view. But then like when it comes to Black Lives Matter, there were a lot of people, including people who like consider themselves to be the core, like the people who set up organizations associated with this, and they do believe that like liberal democracy is bad, and that the liberal system, the liberal democratic order, will never respond to um, any attempts to reform it from within, and we do need to like enact violence to bring about our political will. Like, like they did, they took over cities, they created an autonomous zone in what was it, Portland or Seattle? Like
Yeah.
they were like trying to implement like their own illiberal political ideology and impose it upon other people, and like that was what they viewed as being a part of Black Lives Matter. Like their foundational view for some of the people, not most, but some of the people was like inherently violent and illiberal.
Suppose that may be. Nevertheless, I feel it still stands that it doesn't not necessarily negate sort of the legitimacy of concern over Black Lives Matter and all of the sort of protests that happen. And there is some legitimacy to be had in saying that like some of this stuff doesn't take effect because like not a whole lot of reforms did happen. There is usually things get worse before they get better. Um, it's a tricky thing to navigate. Um, I would say that a lot of that stuff that happened with Zoe Quinn was sort of very foundational. A lot of the misogyny, like it was called burgers and fries because five guys, because there was originally five guys who Zoe Quinn allegedly like had relationships with that were being called out.
Though to
Um,
clarify, Aaron Gjoni said that he did the Five Guys thing because of infidelity, not because of
mhm.
slut shaming, and that he's like a pretty progressive person on this stuff, and he doesn't like it to be slut shamed. Like he did say that, and in the chat room actually, the Burgers and Fires IRC channel, I went through the logs a little bit, um, or someone claiming to be him said that. I don't, you know, who knows with the sort of stuff, but so he says that it wasn't because of slut shaming, because if he wanted an infidelity shame, which like that might be a bad thing that you shouldn't do either, but like it is slightly different.
I think there's a bit of death of the author here. I don't think it matters too terribly much because people saw in it what they wanted to see. um, and it went the way it did. Um, and yeah, I feel like we're circling around a little bit
Yeah, we are.
in that.
We can. I do want to ask one question though. Like,
Hmm.
do you think part of the reason that BLM, for instance, is like very considered like in higher regard, except in like conservative circles generally. But even like Mitt Romney, right, the former presidential candidate for the Republican Party, participated in the BLM protests, right? So like it was bipartisan to a high degree also. But like
Right.
fundamentally, like, is it that you view? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like, do you view like Black Lives Matter, even if it had a lot of bad aspects to it? Like, do you think that that's like a more important thing than video games? So like, who cares if the video game people are have their own like sometimes legitimate concerns?
I mean, of course, it's more important, but it's also important to note that, like, in modern society, especially as adults, we do not have the luxury of only dealing with one thing at a time. So, if there is a moment to be had for video games, then it is a moment that is worth having. Um, and yeah, it was a little somewhat bipartisan support, largely because the way that it, well, for one, like it was in response to something like unquestioningly bad, like all the like um, deaths without any. I keep forgetting this freaking word. where help me out here. Like, what's the thing where like someone is like responsible and if something bad happens, like they are sort of answer for it? Uh,
Well, it was like George Floyd
no, there's a
dying,
word here. Like,
being killed,
oh my
being
god.
murdered. He was convicted of murder.
No, when there's like important word.
Not
Okay.
George Floyd.
Um,
Sorry for the book. I should clarify. Not George Floyd was convicted of murder, but the officer who killed him was convicted of murder.
yeah. What's that word though? For when there is some thing in place where if something happens, there's someone to talk to, there's someone to go to, there's someone to answer for it if there are issues. Um, do you know the word I'm trying to remember?
No, but like that you're appealing to some sort of authority figure, I guess you could say. You're appealing to the
Oh,
police forces, you're appealing to the mayors, you're appealing to the Congress, the state legislature.
yeah, I got it. Accountability is that there is all of these deaths of black people without any accountability from the police, and that for the most part, the police would just rally their wagons around the rally the horses around the wagon or whatever, and nothing meaningful would happen. The police would sort of investigate themselves and absolve themselves of all wrongdoing because like, well, we did it by the books that we define, so everything we did is a-okay because we defined it as a-okay ahead of time. Like, these are things that are bad, and so people protesting things that are bad, especially in the wake of like a tragedy, like that is a righteous thing to do. And the initial mechanism by which they did that civil protest is like the way to do it. So in all those senses, like, it is legitimate. It is sort of a well established path of like, I think we can all agree, like, if you have a problem that is big, having a protest is a legitimate way to sort of air your grievances. So I think that was sort of the reason BLM had legitimacy. GamerGate did not really do any of those things. It didn't really have like the universally accepted denouncement of the inciting event. Not everyone agrees that like Zoe Quinn is this super bad person that needs to be harassed or whatever, and like the harassment that happened immediately in its wake was like not good, and the sort of protest was just kind of a doubling down on it because when the Gamers Are Dead article sort of called out the subsection of people who were doing burgers and fries and all that, GamerGate formed as sort of a doubling down on it. It's like, well, you attacked this subset of us, sort of irregardless of what the nature of the criticism was. So we're going to rally around and double down on it, and sort of like that's sort of why it was bad.
But people saw it as, and you might disagree with their perception of it, but they saw it as an attack on the gamer identity.
um,
And they saw it as people painting with a very broad brush rather than like a very targeted critique of like people who engage in harassment are bad, or people who have sexist views are bad, and they should change those views. Like they didn't see it as like that kind of a thing. They saw it as all these articles coming out. I believe it was 10 on the first day, and then 9 additional articles in the following days. They saw it as very much painting with a broad brush, and possibly even like coordination by the games journalists to some extent to do this, especially when like the Game Journal Pros thing leaked out.
um, I took some notes ahead of time. Let me just make sure I find this. Where is it? um, yeah, again, I would just reiterate again that like most of the reaction such people had mostly had to do with the titles of the articles because yeah, they were very incendiary because titles of articles tend to be to get clicks and whatnot. And you reading those alone, you could very well have those reactions. But I found that the content of the articles were not necessarily to that extent. When it comes to all these articles coming out at the same time, like there was this thing that happened to me once that sort of put the nail in the coffin for me for all of these things you constantly see everywhere about people like being concerned about the timing of things, of this and that. Like I went to Anime Expo one year, and at the same time was like the X Games or something in Los Angeles in the summer. And like there was like stuff at the event center, and there was like all these things happening, and there was like this racetrack right outside like Anime Expo like convention hall. So you'll be walking down the big hall, and you'll hear this deafening car just zooming by, and it was awesome. But like it made me think like, because at first I was thinking like, well, why do they have to like have these two things at like right on top of each other at like the same weekend? And then I was like, well, how many weekends are there really in a year? How many are in summer? And like this is Los Angeles, there's millions of people. Then there's so many things that happen in the world. Can we really ever expect them to happen at unique times? Like surely things will happen at the same time all the time, and it's not terribly crazy. It's not terribly unique. It's fairly mundane actually. So when you say like all of these things came out at the exact same time, all these gaming articles, and they all seemed coordinated, maybe there was to some extent some people who were chatting who were coordinating. And it doesn't really concern me that much because for those who did, they did, and for those who didn't, they didn't. And so, sort of concerning yourselves with the ones who did is sort of remarking on, water remarking on the shape of the puddle it's found itself in. You're sort of selecting for your group of people to identify. So, but when it comes to the timing of things like, you know, Gamergate happened, journalists made their observations at the same time. Those who had the similar feelings about it made their conclusions one brainstorm session amount of time later, and then they all wrote one article in one article writing amount of time later. It's not terribly mysterious that they all finished their work and published them in a similar time frame.
Well, the Zoe Quinn, Eron, Joanie, Nathan Grayson, or someone in the chat says it's pronounced Yoni. I don't know.
Mm,
I don't. For the book, I'll spell it right. But
mm,
uh, that was going on like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, about 2 weeks, I think, prior to these articles even coming out.
mm.
So why would they all come out at the same exact moment, though? Like the same day, 10 of them.
I'm
Like
not a
why
journalist, so I
why
don't know
wouldn't
like
they? I
what
did it. I mean, it doesn't seem like they all needed exactly 2 weeks to like do enough like homework on that or whatever. Do,
what context do we have? Because the question is like, oh, is this an artificial amount of time or is this a natural amount of time? And you want something sort of disambiguate between those two possibilities. What do we really have, not being journalists, having no context, or to be able to disambiguate between those two conclusions? And I think we have nothing.
if if the GamerGate people said we're not going to change our hashtag, we like our hashtag, it's an awesome name, and it keeps us all unified together, and we love it, and we think it represents what this is, GamerGate, when gamers from our perspective were attacked. So we're not going to change that, and we're not going to form an official organization. But we're going to continue to be a leaderless movement, but we're going to take steps to make sure that harassment isn't welcome in our spaces and that we condemn that. Would you have been okay with that?
um, any way of going about a thing is going to have pros and cons. Generally speaking, and this is like a broad concept, like the idea of something being good or bad is always just a useful abstraction. Calling something good or bad is kind of, I guess, an abstraction. What you really want, what is more accurate to say is that something, some phenomenon you're evaluating is good at X or good at Y. So you can say like, and every way of approaching a thing is going to have these pros and cons. It's going to be good at things and it's going to not be good at things. It's going to optimize for certain things. It's going to optimize against certain things. So you can say like, well, continuing with the leaderless online anonymous sort of Gamergate approach will optimize at this in this zeitgeist for community cohesiveness, and that may very well be true. But I would say it also optimizes against legitimacy, and that's just going to also be true.
Isn't that approach that like GamerGate took though that I just said, like isn't that like what actually happened though, that we said, hey look, we don't support harassment. We're gonna like even create a harassment patrol. We're not going to allow things on our forums that encourage harassment or that encourage doxing, things like this. We're going to make a very clear stance on this, and
Most
like
mm,
we're going to like mass report the harassment when we see it and have active measures against the trolls, two of whom I'm interviewing actually as part of this project.
part of the difficulty in our two perspectives, I suppose, on this, because you came into GamerGate like a year after it started, I
Well,
believe.
like 6 months, but
Yeah, so some amount of time after a lot of all this stuff like really got the ball rolling. Um, some difference in our perspectives that maybe, I don't know, perhaps irreconcilable is that like I am mostly concerned with the first couple weeks or month or so and how everything sort of began. I am less concerned with the sort of wishy-washy, sort of nebulous, like jumble of things that happened afterwards, because it's a lot and it's hard to make any sort of conclusive like judgments about it all. What I will say is that um, when it comes to GamerGate doing like harassment controls and whatnot after the fact, when you're an adult, you don't get a cookie for behaving in public. And I feel it is much more interesting to interrogate why so much effort had to be expended to rein that in the first place. Why was it so emergent? Why was it so inherent? That is much more of an interesting question to me.
well, isn't this sort of like the nature of like one like online discussions and sometimes there's going to be trolls who want to fuck with people. Sometimes there's going to be flame wars and someone, maybe crosses the line when they get into a heated argument on Twitter. And like that's just sort of like the nature of these online discussions, especially when you're dealing with like a mass leaderless thing.
Um, Not every social group has those dynamics. So the ones that do have them sort of inherently have them, and that is a criticism, potential criticism to have. And yeah, because it remained a leaderless, anonymous sort of online thing, that sort of exacerbated the conditions that produced these issues and made them emergent and made them inherent to the movement. And because the GamerGate did not transition into something more structured like an LLC or whatever, that is sort of why I feel it is a little more to blame, I guess, was a better word that I had in mind, but I'm not going to spend time looking for it.
Yeah, I guess I just like maybe see like online debates that people have on social media like differently. It seems like anytime there's like a controversy or debate on the internet, it seems like people are like way heated and like not good, and there's people trolling. Like look at the Israel Palestine stuff right now, and look at like the insanity on Twitter with that. Like it seems, and I'm a political streamer. Like people fuck with like political streamers and stuff all the time. It's like it's just part of engaging in like online debates with billions of people on the planet. I think, and like that's maybe not like not good, and like that's why we took like active measures to do it. But I think like maybe GamerGate even like did a better job, like probably a far better job than like people in other online debate spaces did at like
I
policing this
guess
behavior. I feel like.
again, it's like what is the sort of situation on the ground that sort of produces it. Like I said, like a lot of these social scenarios don't really, a lot of social spaces don't produce this. So it's interesting to point to Israel Palestine because that's one that does produce it. But there are things like, I don't know what comes to mind. Like I remember in high school there was this thing where like they were considering cutting, because I was a band nerd the whole time. There was something where it was considering cutting funding to some music stuff, and so we had this like march with signs down the main drag of like Santa Clara, California, and we had this little thing at the school district office, and we all had our music and we played a little concert, or whatever. And then like there was some discussions with the people, or whatever. And I wasn't really privy to anything else that happened, so a lot of else probably involved a lot of closed doors, like figuring shit out, and like things seemed to work out in the end. But like that was a social sort of kerfuffle, but it didn't involve like people getting really heated and harassing people and like internet like shitstorms, because that doesn't happen all the time for all these different social contexts. When it does happen, that is notable that that is a social phenomenon in which this sort of thing is emergent and sort of inherent to it. And when a lot of that is more or less pursued deliberately, I suppose, because
Hello
people
there.
were wanting to continue Gamergate in that form and not transition into something like an LLC or that sort of thing that was being discussed. Like it does inevitably produce that, and so there's some blame to be had there, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I've been posting on like internet forums for a long time, and it seems like anytime you get like a large community of people, like there's always going to be like some degree of drama and some degree of like people engaging in flame wars and trolling a little bit. Like anytime like a internet forum or community like reaches a certain size, like even non-controversial stuff, like people who are like look at like the all the toxicity with like the Tumblr like fan art and shipping communities and like all that stuff. Like it seems like almost every online community. Maybe there's some exceptions to where it's not like that, but like it seems like almost like every large community like has like some degree of that sort of thing happening.
Yeah, probably. I feel that like if Gamergate itself as like the movement sort of positioned itself as the sort of more official, I keep saying like LLC or whatever,
Yes.
and like on
Sorry,
the
we are looping a
peripheries.
bit.
Yeah, and if on the periphery is all this like random garbage happened, like I don't know, like I for personally like I don't really interact with like fan communities. If there's a show I like, I just watch the show and I enjoy it on its own. I don't usually go into fan communities and sort of make a big deal over whether or not that fan community is like good or bad or whatever. I'll just enjoy it and I'll talk about it with friends or whatever. But like you say, like a lot of them do that to the extent where it is kind of normal. So ideally, if Gamergate were to have reformed itself into such a formation, all of the randomness happening around it, about it more would have been more acceptable as being sort of just common, I suppose.
We can move off this soon. I just want to ask a question here.
Hmm.
Is there anything Gamergate could have done or should have done in your eyes other than forming like an official organization that would have made it better in your eyes?
Maybe distance itself from sort of the SJW stuff and maybe just focus on like the ethics thing a little more um, explicitly, I suppose. And like really just like we're not like doing with SJW stuff. We're not like complaining about like women or like all these things. We're just gonna be like, we don't want these ethics issues in here. We don't like the censorship. We don't like this or that. But instead, trying to bringing in all the reactionary sort of anti-progressive stuff is like not great.
Would you think that criticizing the social justice warriors, quote unquote, is inherently bad?
I think a lot of social justice stuff is good if at times some of the individual people champion it might do so um, clumsily, but the underlying concepts are good.
I
So something like is it good to like criticize things that are good? It's like I don't know, like we're just being weird at that point. Like you're saying you want things that are bad. I don't know.
well, I don't think that all of the social justice stuff was good. I think that some of it like did warrant criticism, both in terms of like tactics used, which is like mostly what I critiqued, but also like some of the arguments were really bad, and it seemed like they were extraordinarily intolerant of like opposing viewpoints and like weren't even willing to engage in a discussion and wanted to shut down discussions. And they also had like some of them, not everybody, but like some of them had this view that like video games cause real world sexism or real world violence in some cases, which like we obviously found ourselves in opposition with. And the games journalists, like a lot of them had this ideology too.
Um, I think often, especially with more left, the more left you go, um, you'll find more and more people who disagree about things and a lot smaller bubbles of schools of thought that overlap in different ways, but generally it's going to be a lot more fine-grained. Um, I tend to find when you go more rightward, things get a lot more like general and like overarching. People agree with each other more, and there's like larger overlaps. I don't know to speak exactly, but more the more left you go, the more you sort of break things down and deconstruct things and sort of find different ways to look at stuff. And there might be one or two people looking at things in a wacky way, and you do that and try things out. That's fine. But I'm not clear to me to what extent that is meaningful to really catastrophize about that some undoubtedly like really young person who is more or less a kid is clumsily airing wacky ideas. I don't know. And maybe it's in some tiny corner of the internet where like you can't like engage with them. They're like turn off comments on the YouTube video or whatever, right? Or they're like block you if you try to engage with them. It's like it is what it is. It doesn't strike me as something terribly like
Is
worth
is that kind of like
catastrophizing about.
is that kind of like downplaying like the extent to which people went to oppose Gamergate and shut down conversation about this and claim that we were misogynistic harassers and create like block lists to ensure that we were blocked on like large swaths of Twitter and ban us from like every community they possibly could. And it seems like it wasn't just like, oh, this person turned off the comments on their YouTube video. It seems like it was like a lot more of an intense reaction to shut this stuff down and shut down a lot of other conversations too in society and like shrink the Overton window.
I would say that like at the time there was not a whole lot of productive conversation to be had about Gamergate. There was just kind of a lot of shit flinging, and some people took action in response to that, and that's their prerogative, I suppose. Um, Gosh, how should I say this? Um, mm, um, I suppose I'm less concerned about what the quote unquote anti GamerGate people did, because at that point it was just kind of a shit show. And there was just kind of stuff happening all over the place. And it's not really terribly useful to try to extract some sort of conclusion about it all outside of like um, really trying to make conclusions about individual actors or individual events that happen, because you could do that. Man, there's a lot of like events and individual actors doing stuff every goddamn day. It seems like if it directly involves you, then by all means become invested in it. But again, my main concerns about the whole Gamergate dynamic happened is in response to what happened at the very inception of those first couple of weeks and months. After that, it's a blob of whatever, and unfortunately, it does not really contribute much to my broad conclusions about the event, which is that it was this reactionary thing sort of driven by sexism and people doubling down on it. Um, yeah.
You've talked about, I do want to, I'm glad you brought it back here because you talked about how your main critique and issue with Gamergate was relating to like the first few weeks or maybe months. Um, but this is an event, a movement that lasted years. Is it really fair to say like, well, you had a rough two weeks. Now we're going to judge you based on these 2 weeks and nothing else that you ever do?
Um, I guess I would go back to the comparison to like Project Chinology, which is that Chinology did have that turning point where it sort of gained legitimacy. And the problem is that GamerGate never really did. So I don't think it's terribly confounding why GamerGate people struggle to find a seat at the table. Um, there's there's an extreme example. Hopefully it won't be too distracting, but like I'll use it anyway because it was something that I thought of ahead of time before starting this interview. Like, gosh, imagine someone creating a branch of the KKK and then doing a bunch of like good public service works and being like, well, why the heck am I not being received well? I'm objectively doing good public service works. And it's like, well, what, why the association? It's just not a good wagon. It's not a good horse. It's not a good wagon to hitch your horse to. And it does sort of taint stuff. And there isn't a whole lot of making up for what happened before to sort of like make us not care about that.
Yeah.
Mind this is an extreme example. I don't want to get too
Yeah,
distracted
no,
by
I'm
it, but
not
like the
gonna.
point is
I could go down this path and be like, oh my god, how dare you? But
yeah, but the
I don't
point
think it's
is
gonna
to
be a
like
productive discussion. I
yeah,
but I don't think I don't think it's analogous, both in the sense
mm,
that like the KKK like that's like an actual bad thing, whereas like I don't think GamerGate like is this actual bad thing. I think like obviously with any large community of people, you're gonna have like some bad actors within it, but I don't think that like the KKK like it's like their whole mission statement is like we hate everybody. We hate black people. We kill black people. Like that horrible stuff, right?
yeah,
And GamerGate is we care about ethics in games journalism and creative freedom, and like maybe a couple people are sexist and that's bad, and we don't support that.
yeah. But the issue is that the original inception of GamerGate was this bad thing, and that is sort of the
Well, that's your perception
history that I'm sort of
of it, though, right?
yeah, and that is why I'm on this sort of side of things. You know, to me, the beginning of GamerGate was there was this incident, salacious incident, and this guilted boyfriend who like posted this tirade, and then everyone started harassing this woman, um, and then there was a lot of kerfuffle created around it, a community created around it, this whole burgers and fries thing, and then it was called out, and then everyone sort of doubled down and took the side of the sexism. And then that was the whole beginning. And I remember at the time, especially because I was there as it was starting. I was there observing things as it was happening. And one of the big things that I observed in the immediate like genesis of GamerGate was that on forums, on GamerGate spaces, like they were enumerating articles that were speaking about GamerGate. And if it was against GamerGate, that journalist or publication was being put on a shit list, and they're like trying to find all these reasons, making up all these reasons why they're bad and doing all these things. So it was sort of, it ended up just being basic bitch tribalism. Like we have our side, they're against our side, so we'll be against them, regardless of any arguments or context or reasons or logic. It was just I'm on this side, screw anyone else on the other side, which doesn't really, it's not conducive to like a, how should I say, principled ethical position. It's just
Is
conducive to just sort of it starts the initial wave of outrage and it immediately transitioned into just outrage fueling itself and not really for any other reason.
I mean, some of the journalists who covered GamerGate early on even had like a pretty negative view of it, like Ezra Klein and David Auerbach. But like we still thought that it did like a pretty fair job, whereas like other publications just like straight out lied about us from our perspective. They were lying and being dishonest. But like I think like David Auerbach's article, "How to End GamerGate," a divide and conquer plan for dissolving a toxic online movement. But I got involved with GamerGate after he wrote this article. He wrote it in October 2014. Um,
Mhm.
but here I'll link it. But like this, I remember hearing at the time, everyone was like, "Oh yeah, David Auerbach, he's a fair-minded person. He's he's neutral on GamerGate." He even's like, if you read his stuff, he's like a bit more negative on it actually. Um, but he's I think we gave him a fair hearing, and like he was pretty widely respected by our community, despite having a negative opinion of GamerGate as a whole.
Mhm.
And this was early on, like you say, October 2014. And Ezra Klein's article, I have to look up when the date was. Ezra Klein, GamerGate, was a Vox article, um, November of 2014. So still pretty early on in the movement.
Mhm.
And he was pretty critical of GamerGate too, but he was pretty fair in how he approached it. And I even referenced that in my book as well. Like it seems like if you made like a fair critique, we'd be willing to hear you out. But if you just said GamerGate are misogynists who hate women, like we would be like, no, fuck you. Which I think is like a fair response.
Um,
And even the people who were assholes, like, and wrote these articles that made broad generalizations. Or I'll link the Ezra Klein article too. Sorry, I should have done that. Like I mean, I'm sure you saw some of my videos where I responded to articles about GamerGate. Granted, this was not in the first few months, but this was later on. But I think like I was pretty reasonable, like in my critiques. I wasn't like, or do you disagree?
um, I guess I'd have to look into these. But how should I say? I have a thought, and let me see if I can put it into words. Um, if GamerGaters found these particular articles like good because they were fair in the representation of both sides or whatever, um, that like for how should I say? When you say like the articles that would be denounced were the ones just saying that GamerGate was like sexist or whatever, um, especially at the beginning of GamerGate, it kind of was. And so because GamerGate may not have gotten a quote unquote fair shake from the perspective of GamerGaters because they had some ethical concerns underlying all of that, especially people who would sort of join the movement. And this is why it gets more complicated going forward past the first couple of weeks because people did join who were concerned about ethics or whatever and censorship and these sort of things. And that sort of muddies the water quite a bit. But right at the very beginning, that's not what it was about. And so people who would say that, yeah, this was about sexism, they may not be representing the GamerGaters position, but they're sort of what they are saying is fair. And I liken it kind of to if you have a news program or whatever, do you host how should I say? Like, is it sensible as like a news organization to host like a debate or whatever between like a scientist and like a flat earther and to sort of present them both as of equal weight and merit? I would say no, it's not actually the media's job to just present both sides and let the reader decide, because doing so will always sort of present both sides as of equal merit and consideration. And that can be misinformation. You mislead your audience by like not saying like, hey, like one of these sides is actually just bad.
But isn't
And
that
you
what
can
like?
say that,
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so you can say that's having a bias, but like sometimes the reality has a bias and not, and lots of kerfuffles between two quote unquote sides. Like what I find in real life is that most times one side is just wrong.
But isn't it the job of a journalist though to to report on both sides and present both sides of the story, even if like they are of the view that like one side is bad, like David Auerbach, right? He's of the side that GamerGate was bad, but like also there's like some legitimacy to the critiques that they have, and if you want it to go away, you're gonna have to like address some of the actual concerns that they have in like a fair-minded way. So he presented both sides, and he still had like a negative view of GamerGate, and he still put that in his article even. Like, isn't he doing both sides, but also doing it in a more fair-minded way than like we're not even going to include the perspective that GamerGate people have.
I suppose it depends on the thoroughness of um, the publication, because yeah, it would definitely be more thorough to do that. If someone wants to do something less thorough, then I guess that's whatever. But And if they like lied about things, I suppose that's whatever too. But if their overall thrust is that like, yeah, this thing was sexist and it was bad, like I feel that is sufficient for however much it's worth. And you can say like, well, would it be more worth if you put in way more effort? It's like, yeah, well, probably always, but um, I don't feel it is. If it's difficult to reconcile this, I suppose, if one doesn't agree that was bad. But again, like I said, when it comes to like as things progress from the initial like inception of GamerGate, and to even when like you came into the thing, like the waters get muddier. People who actually do care about ethics or whatever like find themselves roped in. Again, it's a weird wagon to hitch your horse to, but like, and there is some lack of due diligence I would put on such people. Like, not sometimes you might, how should I say? It's easy to be a person who's like, I'm just concerned with like censorship in games because I want like this game to like come out with like all the original whatever. And you see someone advocating for that, and you're like, yeah, that I'll align myself with that. Like, I'll signal boost this, and that's like sort of the end of the thought process. I understand it. I'm a little disappointed, but I'm not really putting all of the culpability. That's the word I was trying to think of before. On them. It's not quite the same. And as GamerGate sort of dragged on and got a little more muddy, sort of the culpability of the people joining later who did have these concerns, like I don't really extend it to them quite as hard. It was really just mainly the beginning where a
Okay.
lot of the culpability is to be assigned.
Hi, I'm Tachyon Blue. Thank you for watching another one of my GamerGate book video segments. Altogether, I've interviewed over 70 people involved with GamerGate, and I'm going to be launching a Kickstarter campaign in the coming weeks. So please, I need your support to help make this project a reality. I'm turning these 70 plus interviews into a multi-volume series of books, the first volume of which is already completed. And so I'd like you to please stay tuned for more information about the Kickstarter. And if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and comment. More updates will be coming in the near future. Thank you, and take care.